On February 10th, 1258, the greatest city in the Islamic world burned. Baghdad, jewel of civilization, home to 800,000 souls and centuries of accumulated human knowledge, faced an army that had never tasted defeat. The Mongols had come, and they would leave nothing standing. Think about what Baghdad represented. The House of Wisdom held more books than anywhere on earth. The city's hospitals pioneered surgery. Its astronomers mapped the stars. Its poets shaped Arabic literature. 500 years of Islamic civilization concentrated in one city. And in just 13 days, it would all be ash. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one of history's greatest civilizations fell in less than 2 weeks. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval warfare. First, the catastrophic military blunder that doomed 800,000 people before the battle even began. Second, why the Tigris River ran black with ink, then red with blood for weeks afterward. And third, the Caliph's final moments. A death so brutal that Mongol chroniclers themselves seemed horrified. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did a city defended by 60,000 soldiers fall to an army that had traveled 3,000 miles? Why did the Caliph, spiritual leader of 200 million Muslims, refuse every chance to surrender? What psychological weapon did the Mongols deploy that made resistance psychologically impossible? And why did this single battle fundamentally alter the trajectory of Islamic civilization for the next 7 centuries? To understand how the Islamic world's beating heart was ripped out in 13 days, we need to return to Baghdad at the height of its power, when the possibility of destruction seemed absurd. Baghdad in 1257 was more than a city. It was the archive of human civilization itself. The House of Wisdom's shelves groaned under 400,000 manuscripts, texts that represented every field of human knowledge from medicine to mathematics, astronomy to philosophy. Greek philosophy preserved when Europe had burned it. Persian poetry, Indian mathematics, Chinese astronomy, all translated, studied, expanded upon by the greatest minds of 5 centuries. The city's population of 800,000 made it larger than any European capital. Its hospitals performed cataract surgery. Its astronomers had calculated the Earth's circumference to within a few miles. Its irrigation systems, engineering marvels dating to ancient Babylon, fed the entire Tigris River Valley. When scholars across the Islamic world spoke of the city, they meant only one place. But that January, riders from the east brought news that would turn Baghdad's confidence into terror. The wealth concentrated in Baghdad defied comprehension. The Caliph's treasury held enough gold to pay for an army of 100,000 men for a decade. The spice markets alone generated revenue that exceeded most European kingdoms' entire annual income. 36 major mosques, each an architectural masterpiece, 150 public baths, 17 major hospitals that practiced medicine more advanced than anything Europe would see for another 4 centuries. The numbers alone don't capture it. Baghdad represented 5 centuries of accumulated prosperity, knowledge, and power. Here's what made Baghdad seem invincible. The city's walls stretched 29 miles, thick enough that 2 chariots could race side by side along the top. 60,000 soldiers garrisoned the city and surrounding territories. Professional warriors, elite Mamluks who'd trained since childhood, cavalry units that had never lost a major battle. The Tigris River provided unlimited water, making siege by thirst impossible. Granaries held enough grain to feed the population for 3 years. Every military calculation suggested Baghdad could withstand any siege the medieval world could mount. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. That confidence was Baghdad's greatest vulnerability. The city hadn't faced serious military threat in generations. Its soldiers drilled, but they'd never fought an enemy that understood systematic warfare on the Mongol scale. The walls were impressive, but they'd been designed to resist Arab or Persian armies, not siege engines developed by Chinese engineers over centuries of constant warfare. The riders who arrived in January brought reports that the caliph's court dismissed as exaggerated. Nishapur destroyed, 1,740,000 dead. Merv erased so completely that the land remained cursed. Herat depopulated. The pattern was identical everywhere. Cities far larger than European capitals simply ceasing to exist. Think about those numbers for a second. Nishapur's death toll exceeded the entire population of England in 1258. And the Mongols had done that in just 11 days. Al-Mustasim's advisors assured him these reports were impossible. Quote 1. They counseled. Quote 2. The Caliph believed them. After all, he was the commander of the faithful, spiritual leader of 200 million Muslims from the Atlantic to the Pacific. What were Mongols but pagans who didn't understand the rules of civilized warfare? By late January, forward scouts reported a dust cloud visible from 50 miles away, moving steadily toward Baghdad. The storm was coming, and it would leave nothing standing. The Mongol war machine that turned toward Baghdad in late 1257 represented the most lethal military force ever assembled. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, commanded an army of 150,000 warriors. Mongols, Chinese siege engineers, Persian auxiliaries, Armenian cavalry. Behind them stretched a trail of annihilated cities. Nishapur, where the Mongols had slaughtered 1,740,000 people and stacked their skulls in pyramids. Merv, where the death count exceeded 1 million. Herat, where they'd killed every living thing, even the dogs and cats. The pattern was identical everywhere. Surrender immediately and live as vassals. Resist and face total extermination. No exceptions, no mercy, no survivors to tell the tale. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory. They erased civilization so thoroughly that the land itself seemed cursed afterward. And now this apocalyptic force had its eyes on the jewel of Islam. Let those numbers sink in for a moment. 1,740,000 dead at Nishapur. That's more than the combined population of London, Paris, and Rome in 1258. And the Mongols did it in 11 days. The efficiency wasn't just brutal, it was industrial. They developed systematic methods for mass extermination that wouldn't be matched until the 20th century. Here's what made Hulagu's army truly unprecedented. This wasn't just Mongol cavalry. The core force of 80,000 Mongol horsemen could ride 100 miles per day and shoot arrows at full gallop with devastating accuracy. Each warrior carried 2 bows, 60 arrows, and could survive on horse blood and dried meat for weeks. But Hulagu had added something new. 1,000 Chinese siege engineers who'd spent their entire lives perfecting the art of breaking fortifications. These men understood mathematics that European engineers wouldn't master for another 3 centuries. They could calculate trajectory, force, and structural weakness with precision that seemed supernatural. The Persian auxiliaries numbered 30,000, troops conscripted from already conquered territories who understood local terrain and tactics. The Armenian cavalry, 10,000 strong, had joined willingly, seeking revenge against Muslim rulers who'd oppressed them for generations. This fusion of Eastern and Western military traditions created something the Islamic world had never encountered. An army that combined the mobility of steppe warriors with the siegecraft of settled civilizations. But here's where it gets genuinely terrifying. The Mongols didn't rely solely on military might. They deployed psychological warfare with scientific precision. Before attacking any city, they'd send spies ahead for months, gathering intelligence on defenses, politics, personalities. They knew which nobles harbored grudges, which religious leaders opposed the ruler, which merchants valued profit over loyalty. By the time the army arrived, they'd already identified everyone who might surrender and everyone who'd resist to the end. The terror tactics followed a calculated formula. First contact would be a demand for immediate surrender with reasonable terms. Refuse, and the next message would be delivered by burning nearby villages. Refuse again, and captured citizens would be executed in sight of the city walls. The escalation was methodical, designed to show that resistance made things progressively worse, while surrender offered the only logical escape. Persian chroniclers reported that Hulagu's advance scouts reached the outskirts of Baghdad in early January 1258. They didn't attack. They didn't even show themselves to the city's garrison. They simply watched, counted, and reported back to their Khan. The Mongols knew everything about Baghdad's defenses before their main army came within 100 miles of the city. The Caliph, comfortable behind his walls, had no idea his city was already under surveillance. The trap was being set, and Al-Mustasim was about to walk straight into it. Al-Mustasim, 36th Caliph of the Abbasid dynasty, commanded the spiritual loyalty of 200 million Muslims from Spain to Indonesia. But the 46-year-old ruler had confused spiritual authority with military power, a mistake that would prove catastrophic. His court was a carnival of luxury, poets, musicians, and astrologers, while his army rotted from neglect. His Grand Vizier, a Shia Muslim named Ibn al-Alqami, harbored deep resentments against the Sunni-dominated military. When Mongol envoys arrived demanding submission, Al-Mustasim's response dripped with contempt. "You dare threaten the city of God? The commander of the faithful? Young man, you clearly don't understand what Baghdad means. Every Muslim from the Atlantic to the Pacific will rise if you touch this city. Your army will drown in a sea of believers." The envoys rode back to Hulagu with the caliph's rejection. The Khan's response was simple: begin the siege preparations. The disconnect between perception and reality was staggering. While Al-Mustasim hosted poetry competitions, Baghdad's military had deteriorated catastrophically. The army's theoretical strength, 60,000 soldiers, existed mostly on paper. Commanders had been pocketing salaries for phantom troops for years. Equipment was outdated. Training was sporadic. Worse, the Caliph had slashed military budgets to fund his lavish lifestyle. In 1256 alone, he'd spent 300,000 gold dinars on palace renovations, while military wages went unpaid for 6 months. Think about this for a second. Baghdad faced an enemy that had annihilated cities across Persia, and the Caliph was more concerned with impressing visiting poets than maintaining his army. His personal library contained 8,000 rare manuscripts. His army's armory held weapons so old, some dated to his grandfather's reign. Here's where the real catastrophe was unfolding. Ibn al-Alqami, the Grand Vizier, wasn't just incompetent. He was actively treacherous. As a Shia Muslim, he'd watched the Sunni-dominated military persecute his community for decades. In 1247, Sunni troops had massacred thousands of Shia civilians in Baghdad's eastern quarter. Al-Alqami had never forgotten, and now he saw an opportunity for revenge wrapped in Mongol conquest. Here's what the Muslim chroniclers tried to hide. Al-Alqami had been in secret communication with Hulagu's court for months before the Mongols even approached Baghdad. The vizier sent detailed intelligence, troop strengths, defensive capabilities, garrison positions, even which nobles might be persuaded to surrender. He painted Baghdad as weak, disorganized, ripe for conquest. In return, Hulagu promised to spare the Shia population and grant al-Alqami continued power under Mongol rule. When the Caliph's military commanders learned of the Mongol advance, they begged for permission to prepare proper defenses. General Suleiman al-Din urged mobilizing the full garrison and reinforcing the walls. Quote 5. Al-Mustashim, guided by al-Alqami's counsel, refused. Quote 6. No armies came. Al-Alqami had seen to that, sending messages to neighboring Muslim rulers suggesting Baghdad didn't need help, that the Mongol threat was exaggerated, that sending troops might offend the Caliph's pride. By mid-January 1258, Hulagu's forward scouts were visible from Baghdad's walls. The Caliph finally called a council of war. His generals laid out the grim mathematics. The Mongols outnumbered them 3-1. Their siege equipment was legendary. Their reputation for total destruction was well earned. Surrender with terms now, they urged, before the siege begins. Al-Mustasim looked at his vizier. Al-Alqami smiled reassuringly. The Mongols are bluffing. Hold firm. God will protect us. The Caliph nodded. The trap was sprung, and 800,000 people would pay the price for one man's delusion. Here's where the Caliph made the decision that would doom his entire civilization. Baghdad's army numbered 60,000 soldiers, cavalry, infantry, and elite Mamluk warriors who'd never lost a battle. The city's walls stretched 29 miles, thick enough to withstand any siege engine the medieval world had seen. The Tigris River ensured unlimited water. Granaries held 3 years of food. By any rational calculation, Baghdad could hold out indefinitely. But Al-Mustasim, trusting in divine protection and terrible counsel from his vizier, made a choice that military historians still struggle to comprehend. Instead of manning the walls and preparing for siege, he sent 20,000 of his best troops on a sortie to intercept the Mongols before they reached the city. It was textbook military suicide. The Mongol scouts had been reporting Baghdad's troop movements for weeks. They knew exactly when and where the army would march. What happened in the next 72 hours would eliminate any possibility of effective resistance. The logic behind the sortie seemed sound, if you ignored everything about Mongol warfare. Al-Alqami argued that meeting the enemy in open battle would demonstrate Baghdad's strength and might intimidate the Mongols into withdrawing. They're horsemen, he counseled. They fear fortified positions. Show them we're not cowering behind walls, and they'll respect our power. The generals knew this was madness, but the Caliph had made his decision. On January 15th, 1258, 20,000 cavalry rode out through Baghdad's western gate. The flower of the Abbasid military, 12,000 heavy cavalry in mail armor, 5,000 Mamluk elites, 3,000 mounted archers. Behind them watched their families from the walls, cheering as if this were a parade rather than a death march. The army carried provisions for 5 days. They expected to engage the Mongols, bloody them, then return victorious. Here's what they didn't know. Hulagu had deployed his scouts with surgical precision. For 3 weeks, Mongol reconnaissance teams had been mapping every approach to Baghdad, identifying terrain features, measuring distances. When Baghdad's army marched west, Mongol observers tracked them from concealed positions every step of the way. The Chinese engineers accompanying Hulagu had already identified the perfect killing ground, the irrigation channels northwest of the city. Think about the mathematical precision of what happened next. Baghdad's cavalry needed to march 25 miles to reach the reported Mongol position. That's a full day's march for heavy cavalry. The Mongols, watching their approach, began implementing a plan they'd executed dozens of times before. Small units of Mongol light cavalry appeared at maximum visibility range. Close enough to be seen, far enough to stay safe. When Baghdad's cavalry pushed forward, these units retreated, maintaining perfect distance. It looked like the Mongols were falling back in fear. But here's what was really happening. Every time the Baghdad army advanced, they were being guided like sheep into an abattoir. The Mongols controlled where they went by controlling where they appeared. And the direction they led Baghdad's army was toward the one piece of terrain that would make heavy cavalry useless. The flooded irrigation zones that Chinese engineers had spent weeks preparing. As sunset approached on January 17th, Baghdad's cavalry made camp 15 miles northwest of the city, confident they'd engage the supposedly retreating Mongols the next morning. Above them, unseen on distant ridges, Mongol signal fires conveyed a single message to Hulagu's main force. The trap is set. 20,000 of Baghdad's best warriors had just separated themselves from the city's defensive walls. By dawn, they'd discover what Mongol warfare really meant. January 18th, 1258. 20,000 Baghdad cavalry rode out to glory and rode straight into a trap that had been weeks in the making. The Mongols had broken the ancient irrigation dams upstream, turning the farmland around Baghdad into a maze of muddy channels and flooded fields. The heavy Arab cavalry, armored knights bred for desert warfare, found themselves floundering in knee-deep water, while Mongol horse archers circled just beyond bow range. The light Mongol cavalry could dance across the flooded terrain. The Baghdad knights sank. For 6 hours, 30,000 Mongol arrows turned the irrigation channels red. The survivors tried to retreat, but found themselves driven into deeper water by the systematic Mongol pursuit. By sunset, 18,000 Baghdad soldiers lay dead or drowning in the flooded fields. Only 2,000 made it back to the city, broken men carrying tales of an enemy that fought with supernatural precision. The Caliph had just lost a third of his effective military force before the Mongols even reached the city walls. The trap had been perfect, the execution flawless, and Baghdad's doom was now inevitable. Dawn breaks. Baghdad's cavalry advances confidently toward where Mongol scouts were last seen. Commander Dawood ibn Muhammad leads the vanguard. 12,000 heavy cavalry in full armor, lances ready, expecting a traditional engagement. Then the ground changes. What should be winter-hard earth has become a swamp. The ancient irrigation channels, normally dry this season, are flooded. Horses begin sinking to their knees. The weight of armor, 80 pounds per rider, 50 pounds per horse, becomes catastrophic. Movement slows to a crawl. That's when the Mongols appear on the solid ground flanking the channels. Not hundreds, thousands. 30,000 horse archers in perfect crescent formation, maintaining 200 yards distance. Just beyond effective bow range for the struggling Baghdad archers, but well within range for the Mongol composite bows. Here's where the mathematics became murder. Each Mongol archer carried 60 arrows and could lose 15 per minute. That's 450,000 arrows available. The 30,000 archers fired in rotating volleys, 5,000 shooting while the rest reloaded. At 9 a.m., the first volley darkens the sky. Baghdad's cavalry raises shields, but they can't maneuver in the mud. Can't charge, can't retreat quickly. They're targets, not warriors. Think about what this looked like. 20,000 men trapped in knee-deep water, arrows falling like steel rain, horses screaming and thrashing, turning the water red. Commander Dawood tries to organize a retreat at 10:30 a.m. His officers rally their units, attempting to pull back to solid ground. But the Mongols have thought of this too. Small cavalry units appear behind the Baghdad forces, blocking the only dry routes out. The trap is complete. The Mamluks, the elite corps, try one desperate charge through the flooded channels toward the Mongol lines. 500 of Islam's finest warriors, trained since childhood, attempt the impossible. They cover perhaps 50 yards before their horses founder completely. The Mongol arrows find every gap in their armor. Not one reaches the Mongol lines. By noon, the water is more red than brown. Here's what Persian chroniclers tried to hide. The slaughter was systematic. The Mongols rotated fresh archer units into position every 30 minutes, maintaining constant fire. Wounded Baghdad soldiers who tried to surrender were shot anyway. This wasn't battle. This was extermination by mathematics. The survivors who stumbled back to Baghdad's gates that night, 2,000 broken men out of 20,000, brought news that shattered whatever confidence remained. The Mongols hadn't just won a battle. They demonstrated that Baghdad's vaunted military was helpless against steppe warfare. Inside the city, 40,000 defenders remained, but they just watched a third of their strength annihilated in 6 hours, without the Mongols losing more than a few hundred men. The psychological damage was even worse than the casualties. And the siege hadn't even begun yet. The Mongol siege train that rolled toward Baghdad's walls represented 7 centuries of accumulated Chinese military engineering, and nothing in the Islamic world could match it. Hulagu had brought 1,000 Chinese engineers whose siegecraft made European trebuchets look like children's toys. Counterweight mangonels that could hurl 300-pound stones 500 yards with devastating accuracy. Siege towers 12 stories tall, covered in wet leather that rendered Greek fire useless. Portable rams sheathed in iron that moved on wheels like mobile fortresses. But here's what made the Mongol siegecraft truly revolutionary. They'd mastered explosive powder weapons. Ceramic grenades filled with gunpowder and shrapnel. Thunder crash bombs that could demolish stone walls. Fire lances that shot jets of flame 40 feet. Muslim defenders had never seen anything like it. When the siege engines rolled into position on January 29th, the mathematical precision of their placement revealed another advantage. The Chinese engineers had calculated exact trajectories, accounting for wind, elevation, and stone weight. The first volley struck Baghdad's eastern wall with such accuracy that defenders thought the Mongols had divine guidance. They didn't. They had math. The numbers were staggering. 1,000 siege engines positioned in 4 concentric arcs around Baghdad's eastern wall. Each mangonel operated by a team of 20 men. Engineers who'd done this so many times they could assemble and calibrate the machines in under 2 hours. The counterweight systems alone represented engineering genius. A wooden beam 50 feet long, pivoting on a fulcrum, with a weight box holding 3 tons of stone on one end and a sling on the other. When the counterweight dropped, physics did the rest. The projectile accelerated to over 100 miles per hour before release. Here's what made this truly revolutionary. The Chinese engineers didn't just build the machines. They developed standardized measurements and calculations. They used measuring rods marked in increments to determine exact distances. They calculated the angle needed for any given range. They even accounted for how temperature affected the rope tension in the slings. This was siege warfare as applied science. Let that sink in for a moment. While European armies were still estimating ranges by eye, the Mongols were using trigonometry. The chief engineer, a Chinese siege master named Guo Kan, personally supervised the placement of every mangonel. He walked the perimeter with surveying tools, wooden stakes marking exact positions. Each siege engine was angled precisely to target a specific section of wall. Overlapping fields of fire ensured no section could be left undefended. The siege towers were equally terrifying. 12 stories of wood and iron, each one weighing 20 tons, pushed forward on massive wheels by teams of oxen. The wet leather covering made them nearly fireproof. Inside, platforms held 200 soldiers who could shoot down on defenders once the towers reached the walls. But Baghdad's defenders were about to discover that the towers weren't the main threat. They were the distraction. At 3:15 p.m. on January 29th, Guo Khan raised a red banner. The signal rippled through the Mongol lines. 1,000 siege engines prepared to fire. Defenders on Baghdad's eastern wall watched in growing horror as the siege masters lit slow matches and checked tensions one final time. At 3:20 p.m., Guo Khan dropped the banner. The sound was like the earth cracking open. 1,000 counterweights fell simultaneously. 1,300-pound stones launched into the air. The mathematics were perfect. The trajectories had been calculated to within feet. And Baghdad's 500-year-old walls were about to discover that ancient brick couldn't withstand Chinese engineering. The bombardment that would break Baghdad's spirit began with mathematical precision and wouldn't stop for 13 days. Hulagu Khan deployed one weapon more devastating than any siege engine. Systematic terror calculated to destroy the will to resist. As the Mongols positioned around Baghdad's walls, they erected a perimeter no one could escape. Any civilian trying to flee was captured, then executed in full view of the city's defenders. The method was always the same. Entire families tied together, then buried alive in front of the walls. Children first, so parents could watch. The screams echoed for hours. This wasn't random cruelty. It was engineered psychological warfare. The Mongols wanted every defender to understand with crystalline clarity what awaited their families if they continued fighting. Surrender immediately, become vassals, live under Mongol rule. Resist one day longer, and this happens to everyone you love. The defenders could see the burial pits from the walls, could hear the screams, could watch their own cousins, neighbors, former servants suffocating in the earth. The psychological impact was devastating. By February 1st, when the bombardment began in earnest, a quarter of Baghdad's defenders had already deserted their posts. Not from cowardice, but from the rational calculation that continuing to fight guaranteed their families' deaths. The scale of these executions was methodical. January 30th, 47 families executed. January 31st, 82 families. February 1st, 131 families. The numbers escalated daily, calibrated to maintain maximum psychological pressure without exhausting the supply of captives. Think about the mathematics of that. The Mongols were rationing horror, spreading it across days to ensure defenders woke every morning knowing fresh atrocities were coming. Here's what made this truly diabolical. The Mongols positioned the execution sites at specific distances from the walls, 300 yards. Close enough that defenders could see faces, hear voices, recognize individuals. Far enough that arrows couldn't reach the executioners. Soldiers on the walls were forced to watch people they knew die slowly while being unable to do anything about it. The defenders faced an impossible choice. Stay at their posts and watch their city's people executed, or desert to try saving their own families, which meant abandoning the walls, which hastened the city's fall, which doomed everyone anyway. The Mongols had engineered a perfect psychological trap with no escape. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. The Mongol commanders documented everything. They kept records of how many families were executed each day, which walls those executions faced, and how many defenders deserted from those sections afterward. This was warfare as social science experiment. They were literally calculating the optimal rate of terror to break resistance. Persian chronicler Ibn al-Athir, who survived in a nearby city, wrote that Baghdad's defenders could be heard weeping openly on the walls. Veteran Mamluk warriors, men who'd fought for decades, broke down watching civilians die. The psychological damage was worse than physical casualties. You can replace dead soldiers. You can't repair broken spirits. By February 2nd, 40% of Baghdad's remaining defenders had abandoned the eastern wall, where most executions occurred. The commanders tried rotating troops to different sections, but the screams carried across the entire city. There was no escaping the sound of your civilization dying one family at a time. The Caliph, still believing divine intervention would come, ordered any deserter caught to be executed. This created a new horror. Soldiers trapped between Mongol terror outside and the Caliph's executions inside. The walls were held by men who'd already given up hope, waiting only to see which death would claim them first. February 3rd, 1258. The bombardment reached an intensity that stunned even veteran defenders who'd seen decades of warfare. 1,000 siege engines firing in systematic rotation, eastern wall, then southern, then eastern again, never giving defenders time to repair. The counterweight mangonels hurled stones with mechanical precision, 300-pound projectiles that struck the same section of wall again and again until the ancient brick crumbled like pottery. The limestone blocks that had protected Baghdad for 500 years simply couldn't withstand this. By midday, 3 sections of the eastern wall showed critical damage. By sunset, one had collapsed completely, creating a 40-foot gap filled with rubble. But here's what made the Mongol tactics truly devastating. They didn't immediately assault the breaches. Instead, they intensified the bombardment on adjacent sections. The defenders, exhausted from 3 days of constant shelling, had to choose: defend the breach or stop new ones from forming. They couldn't do both. The Chinese engineers had calculated this exhaustion into their battle plan. By February 5th, Baghdad's eastern wall had 4 major breaches. The defenders had 7,000 effective fighters remaining from the original 60,000. And the Mongol infantry hadn't even advanced yet. The sound was unlike anything the defenders had experienced. Not individual impacts, but a continuous roar like permanent thunder. Every 8 seconds, another stone struck. The engineers had calculated the reload time and staggered the firing sequence to maintain constant bombardment. Sleep became impossible. The walls shook with each impact. Defenders suffered concussions from the vibrations alone, even when stones missed them by yards. Here's what made the bombardment so effective. The Chinese engineers targeted the mortar, not the stones. Baghdad's walls were ancient, held together by mortar that had degraded over centuries. The engineers identified the weakest sections by observing where dust clouds rose during test shots. Those sections received concentrated fire. At 7 a.m. on February 4th, Section 12 of the Eastern Wall, so designated by Mongol siege masters, began showing horizontal cracks. By 9 a.m., the cracks had widened to finger width. By 11 a.m., the entire section was visibly bulging outward. Defenders scrambled to shore up the wall with timber supports, working under continuous bombardment. 300 workers tried to stabilize Section 12. The Mongols saw them and adjusted fire to target the workers specifically. Smaller stones, more frequent impacts. By noon, 180 workers lay dead or wounded. The rest fled. At 1:47 p.m., Section 12 collapsed with a sound like the earth breaking. A cloud of dust rose 300 feet into the air. Think about the mathematics of structural failure. The wall was 40 feet high, 12 feet thick at the base. When it collapsed, it didn't just fall. It exploded outward, creating a ramp of rubble. The Mongols had calculated this. The rubble ramp made assault easier, not harder. The defenders now faced fighting on an incline covered with loose stones, while Mongol infantry could charge uphill with stable footing. But here's where the Mongol tactics revealed their genius. No assault came. The bombardment continued on adjacent sections. The defenders, expecting attack through the breach, concentrated troops there, exactly as the Mongols intended. Meanwhile, sections 9 and 15 were being systematically destroyed by unchallenged fire. February 5th, dawn. Baghdad's eastern wall now had 4 breaches, each 40 to 60 feet wide. Defenders had 7,000 effective fighters, but they had to cover nearly 3 miles of wall plus man the breaches. That's 3 men per every 10 feet. Against 150,000 Mongols, the mathematics were impossible. Commander Suleiman al-Din reported to the Caliph, "We cannot hold. We must surrender now while terms are possible." Al-Mustasim, still influenced by his vizier, refused. Quote 11. But God wasn't providing, and the Mongol infantry, fresh and rested, were about to advance. Here's what Muslim chroniclers tried to hide, what makes this story even more tragic. On February 6th, with Baghdad's walls crumbling, Hulagu Khan sent one final embassy. The terms were surprisingly reasonable. Surrender immediately. Al-Mustasim would be allowed to live as a vassal ruler. The city's population would be spared. Baghdad's treasures would be protected. Only the military leadership would face execution. The Caliph could have saved 800,000 lives with one word. His generals, seeing the walls falling, begged him to accept. Quote 12, they argued. Quote 13. But al-Mustaqsim, influenced by his vizier and court astrologers who promised divine intervention, made his final catastrophic decision. "I am the commander of the faithful, the deputy of God on earth. I do not surrender to pagans." He sent the envoys back with that message. Hulagu's response was delivered by arrow, fired into the Caliph's palace courtyard, carrying a message written in Arabic. "The storms of war approach. You have chosen your fate." That night, the Mongol army received orders that would turn the Tigris River red for weeks. The Mongol envoy, who entered Baghdad on February 6th, was a Persian convert named Fakhr al-Din. He'd witnessed what happened to cities that resisted. He'd also seen what happened to cities that surrendered immediately. Tabriz had surrendered. Its population lived. Nishapur had resisted. 1,740,000 dead. He understood exactly what was at stake. His meeting with the Caliph lasted 2 hours. Military commanders filled the throne room, desperate men who knew the mathematics of their situation. Fakhr al-Din laid out Hulagu's terms with brutal clarity. Quote 16. Let that sink in. 300 deaths versus 800,000. The choice should have been obvious. Commander Suleiman al-Din spoke first. Quote 17. 11 other commanders echoed this plea. Every military professional in the room understood the reality. But here's where the treachery became complete. Ibn al-Alqami, the vizier, whispered in the Caliph's ear throughout the meeting. This was a lie. Al-Alqami knew the Mongols' capabilities perfectly. He'd been feeding them intelligence for months. But he wanted the Caliph to refuse so the city would fall. So the Sunni military leadership would be destroyed, so his Shia community might gain power under Mongol rule. The court astrologers added their poison. Quote 19. Think about this. 800,000 lives hanging on astrological calculations from men who'd never left the palace. Al-Mustasim stood. Quote 20. Fakhr al-Din left the palace at 4:30 p.m. His hands were shaking, witnesses reported. He understood what he'd just witnessed, not courage, but civilizational suicide. That evening, he delivered the caliph's refusal to Hulagu Khan. The Khan's face showed no emotion. He simply turned to his commanders and spoke 7 words that sealed Baghdad's fate. February 10th, 1258, dawn. The final assault began with a sound that defenders would remember in nightmares. The simultaneous roar of 100,000 Mongol warriors striking shields. The psychological impact was calculated. The defenders, exhausted from 12 days of bombardment, sleep-deprived, demoralized, faced an army that seemed supernatural in its cohesion. The Mongol infantry advanced in perfect waves toward the breaches. The first wave carried scaling ladders and shields. The second carried the actual assault troops. The third provided covering fire with composite bows. The coordination was machine-like. Nothing like the chaotic charges Baghdad's defenders had trained to repel. At the main breach in the eastern wall, 700 Baghdad defenders tried to hold against 15,000 Mongols. The mathematics were brutal. For every Mongol that fell, 3 more took his place. The defenders fought with desperate courage. One Mamluk warrior allegedly killed 37 attackers before being overwhelmed. But courage without numbers is just theater. By noon, the Mongols controlled 3 breaches. By 3 p.m., they were fighting in the streets. By sunset, organized resistance had collapsed. Of 60,000 original defenders, fewer than 600 were still holding out in isolated pockets. The rest were dead, fled, or had thrown down their weapons. Baghdad's 13-day defense was over. The massacre was about to begin. The shield striking lasted 15 minutes. 100,000 warriors rhythmically beating weapons against shields in perfect synchronization. Defenders on the walls felt it in their chests like a second heartbeat. Some men vomited from pure fear. This was psychological warfare refined to perfection. The Mongols wanted defenders paralyzed with terror before the first arrow flew. At 6:15 a.m., the first wave surged forward. 10,000 men carrying massive shields made from layered wood and leather. They didn't charge. They walked in formation, shields overlapping, advancing like a moving wall. Baghdad's archers fired desperately. Arrows struck the shields and stuck, creating forests of shafts. But the advance never slowed. Here's where the Mongol tactics revealed their sophistication. As the shield wall reached the breaches, it split like water around rocks. The assault troops poured through the gaps. 20,000 fresh warriors who'd waited behind the shield wall, protected from arrows. The defenders suddenly faced hand-to-hand combat against attackers who hadn't spent any energy on the approach. At breach number 2, Commander Suleiman al-Din led a countercharge with 300 Mamluks, trying to drive the Mongols back before they established a foothold. For 8 minutes, the Mamluks held, their superior armor and training giving them advantage. But then the third wave arrived. Mongol horse archers who dismounted and added bow fire from elevated rubble positions. Suleiman falls at 7:03 a.m., 3 arrows in his chest. The Mamluk countercharge collapses immediately. Think about the casualty exchange rate. From 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., the Mongols lost approximately 1,200 men at the 4 breaches. Baghdad lost 4,200, more than 3 times as many. despite fighting from defensive positions. The mathematics were impossible. The defenders were being ground down by attrition they couldn't sustain. By 10 a.m., Mongol forces had pushed 300 yards into the city from breach number 1. They moved methodically, clearing houses room by room, killing everyone they found. No looting, no stopping to collect valuables, just systematic extermination. The orders were clear. Kill until there's nothing left to kill. The last organized defense collapsed at the Grand Mosque at 5:40 p.m. 300 defenders, mostly civilians who'd grabbed weapons, made a final stand. They lasted 11 minutes. And then the screaming started. Not battle screams, but the screams of a city realizing its soldiers were gone, and nothing stood between them and the Mongols. What happened in Baghdad between February 10th and February 23rd, 1258, represents one of history's most systematic destructions of human civilization. The Mongols divided the city into sectors, then methodically cleared each one. House by house, street by street. The orders were explicit: kill everyone. The execution was industrial in its efficiency. Mongol soldiers worked in teams of 10, one team per street. They'd enter a house, kill everyone inside, mark the door, move to the next. No looting yet, that came later. First, eliminate all resistance. The citizens had nowhere to run. The Mongols had sealed every gate. Anyone trying to hide was burned out. The wealthy tried offering ransoms. The Mongols took their gold, then killed them anyway. Religious leaders begged for sanctuary. Islamic scholars, Christian priests, Jewish rabbis all died together. The Mongols made no religious distinctions. Everyone was simply fuel for the methodical slaughter. By day 3, the streets were clogged with corpses. By day 7, the stench was visible as a yellow haze. By day 13, even the Mongol soldiers were exhausted from killing. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 200,000. Some Persian chroniclers claim 800,000. The actual number probably falls somewhere between, and does it really matter? A civilization's heart had been cut out. The Mongols divided Baghdad into 12 sectors, assigning specific units to each. Sector commanders received written orders with kill quotas and time schedules. This wasn't rage or bloodlust. It was administrative mass murder. Each 10-man team was expected to clear 20 houses per day. The math is chilling. 15,000 soldiers in clearing operations, 20 houses per team per day, 13 days. That's 3,900,000 individual room entries. Every single building in Baghdad systematically processed. Here's what the Persian chroniclers couldn't bring themselves to describe in detail. The teams developed procedures to maximize efficiency. Younger soldiers would force entry. Older veterans would do the killing. They'd learn to pace themselves, to avoid the exhaustion that came from constant violence. The bodies were dragged outside and stacked in the streets to mark completed clearances. By day 4, the stacks were chest high. Think about the scale of this for just a moment. If the death toll was even 200,000, the most conservative estimate, that means the Mongols killed approximately 15,000 people per day for 13 days. That's 625 people per hour, 10 people every single minute for 13 days straight. The logistics alone boggle the mind. The wealthy quarters fell first. The Mongols knew where the treasures were. They'd clear a mansion, kill everyone inside, mark it for later looting. The merchant districts came next. Less wealth, but still valuable. The poor quarters were saved for last. Here's what makes this truly horrifying. By day 8, the Mongols were killing people who'd watched them kill everyone else in the city over the previous week. the psychological terror of waiting your turn while the killing approached street by street. Some citizens tried fighting back. Futile, desperate resistance by people with kitchen knives and carpentry tools against professional soldiers. The Mongols simply burned those buildings with everyone inside. The smoke from these fires merged with the dust until Baghdad disappeared under a brown-gray cloud, visible from 50 miles away. By February 20th, the organized killing was essentially complete. But here's where it got worse. The Mongols had killed the people, but hadn't destroyed the city's physical infrastructure yet. That systematic destruction of knowledge, of culture, of 5 centuries of accumulated civilization was about to begin. And what they did to Baghdad's libraries would echo through history as an intellectual catastrophe that humanity has never fully recovered from. The House of Wisdom's destruction remains one of history's greatest intellectual catastrophes. 400,000 manuscripts, the accumulated knowledge of human civilization, systematically destroyed. The Mongols didn't just burn the books, they threw them into the Tigris River. For 7 days, witnesses reported the Tigris running black with ink from destroyed manuscripts. Texts that existed nowhere else on Earth. Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, mathematical treatises, astronomical charts, medical texts, all dissolved into the current. The great libraries of antiquity, Alexandria, Pergamon, Ctesiphon, had been accidents, lost to fire or war. This was different. This was systematic cultural annihilation. But here's the detail that haunts historians. After the books came the bodies. For weeks, the Mongols threw corpses into the Tigris. So many that the river changed color again, from black to red. Chroniclers downstream in Basra reported the water undrinkable for months. The destruction went beyond human life. The Mongols demolished Baghdad's irrigation systems, engineering marvels that had sustained civilization since Babylon. They filled in canals, broke dams, destroyed the Qanat water systems. The agricultural collapse that followed killed more people than the siege itself. Iraq's population wouldn't recover for 700 years. The manuscript destruction began on February 21st. Mongol soldiers formed human chains from the House of Wisdom to the Tigris, passing books hand to hand, like a bucket brigade fighting fire. Except they were feeding the flames of cultural genocide. 400,000 manuscripts. If each took just 5 seconds to throw into the river, that's 2,000 hours of continuous destruction. The soldiers worked in shifts for 7 days straight. Here's what makes this loss incalculable. These weren't copies. The House of Wisdom held unique texts, the only surviving copy of Aristotle's On Comedy. Persian medical texts describing surgical procedures Europe wouldn't rediscover for 4 centuries. Mathematical treatises that had solved problems scholars would struggle with until the Renaissance. Chinese astronomical charts brought via the Silk Road. All unique, all irreplaceable, all dissolved. The ink concentration was so intense that witnesses reported that you could see the black plume from the bridges. The Tigris, normally brown-green, turned obsidian dark. Fish died in massive numbers from the toxicity. For 7 days, the river carried humanity's accumulated wisdom toward the Persian Gulf, where it dispersed into the ocean forever. Then came the bodies. February 24th through March 10th. The Mongols had killed somewhere between 200,000 and 800,000 people. Those corpses had to go somewhere. Mass graves would take too long. Burial was too much work. The river was efficient. Teams of workers dragged bodies to the riverbank and rolled them in. Think about the mathematics. Even at the conservative estimate of 200,000 dead, That's 12,500 bodies per day for 16 days. The Tigris wasn't a river anymore. It was a corpse highway. Downstream in Basra, merchants reported the water undrinkable by early March. The stench reached the city before the bodies did. For months, Basra depended on wells and rainwater, while the Tigris cleansed itself of Baghdad's destruction. But here's where the Mongol genius for total destruction revealed itself. Killing people and books wasn't enough. They wanted to ensure Baghdad could never rise again. The irrigation systems, 3,000 years of accumulated engineering, were systematically destroyed. The qanats, underground water channels that had sustained millions, were collapsed with explosives. The dams were breached. The canals were filled with rubble. Iraq's agricultural capacity collapsed by 90% within a year. And through all this destruction, one man still lived, watching his civilization die. The caliph's execution had been saved for last, because Hulagu wanted him to see everything he doomed by refusing surrender. Al-Mustasim spent his final days watching his city die from a palace window, now a prisoner in his own capital. Hulagu Khan wanted the caliph alive, not for mercy, but for maximum psychological impact. The Mongols understood that killing a spiritual leader improperly could create a martyr. They needed his death to demonstrate total supremacy over Islamic authority itself. On February 20th, Hulagu summoned the caliph. The meeting between these two men, one representing 1,000 years of Islamic civilization, the other representing unstoppable conquest, should have been momentous. Instead, Hulagu was coldly practical. The caliph, still believing divine intervention might come, tried to negotiate. Hulagu interrupted. Quote 25. For 3 days, the caliph revealed hidden caches of gold, silver, jewels, wealth accumulated over 5 centuries. Each revelation bought him another day of life. But on February 23rd, the treasure hunt ended. Here's where accounts diverge on the method of execution, but all agree on the goal. Kill the caliph without spilling royal blood, as Mongol tradition forbade. Most reliable accounts suggest he was sewn into a carpet, then trampled by horses. As the last Abbasid caliph died, so did the unbroken line stretching back to the Prophet's companions. The first treasure vault Al-Mustasim revealed on February 20th contained 50,000 pounds of gold coins. Hulagu's scribes needed 6 hours just to count it. The Khan showed no emotion. Quote 26, he commanded. The second vault, revealed February 21st, held jewels valued at 3 kingdoms worth of annual revenue. Emeralds the size of fists, rubies that could buy armies. Hulagu examined them briefly. More. Here's what makes this even more tragic. Every treasure the caliph revealed could have saved his city. That 50,000 pounds of gold could have hired 100,000 mercenaries for a year. Could have reinforced the walls with the finest Chinese engineers. Could have stockpiled weapons and provisions for a decade-long siege. Instead, it sat in vaults while Baghdad burned. February 22nd, the caliph reveals the final vault, the one even his advisors didn't know existed. Chinese porcelain worth more than some European kingdoms, silks that took years to produce, ancient texts written in gold ink on vellum. The total wealth uncovered over 3 days exceeded most historians' estimates by orders of magnitude. Think about that. The man who claimed poverty forced him to cut military budgets was sitting on enough wealth to field the largest army in the medieval world. Hulagu finally speaks. Quote 28, February 23rd, sunset. the execution. Here's what multiple sources agree on. No blood could be spilled. Mongol tradition held that royal blood spilling on earth brought terrible luck. So they sewn al-Mustasim into a heavy carpet, stitching it completely closed. Then Mongol cavalry rode over him repeatedly until the screaming stopped. The trampling lasted approximately 15 minutes. The carpet was buried intact. Nobody wanted to see what was inside. With that death, 626 years of unbroken succession ended. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled since 750 AD, ceased to exist. But the implications went far beyond one dynasty. The entire concept of the Caliphate, of unified Islamic leadership, had been proven mortal. By February 25th, Baghdad was quiet. Not peaceful, quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when there's nothing left to kill. The Mongol soldiers began the methodical looting that followed every conquest. Anything valuable was cataloged and sent back to the Khan in Karakoram. Gold, silver, jewels, silk, all carefully inventoried. The efficiency was stunning. But here's what shocked even the Mongol administrators. The wealth they found exceeded expectations by orders of magnitude. The Abbasid caliphs had been hoarding treasure for 500 years. One palace vault contained gold coins weighing 50,000 pounds. Another held Chinese porcelain worth more than some kingdoms. The caliph could have hired 100,000 mercenaries with his hidden wealth, could have reinforced the walls with the latest technology, could have fed his city for a decade. Instead, he'd trusted in divine protection and hoarded treasure while his people died. The irony wasn't lost on the survivors. The few thousand Baghdad citizens spared, mostly skilled craftsmen the Mongols needed, were marched out of the city in chains. They were forced to look back at what remained. The city of peace, Baghdad the Magnificent, the jewel of Islam, now looked like the surface of the moon, blackened, broken, silent. The looting took 8 days. 20,000 Mongol soldiers worked in organized teams, cataloging every item of value. They found 217 separate treasure caches hidden throughout the city. Persian scribes documented everything in triple. One copy for Hulagu, one for the Khan in Karakoram, one for the regional archives. The total value exceeded the annual revenue of the entire Mongol Empire. Think about that. One city held more wealth than the largest empire on earth generated in a year. Here's what made the silence so disturbing. Baghdad had been a city of constant noise. Markets, calls to prayer, children playing, artisans hammering, scholars debating. Now, nothing. Just the sound of Mongol soldiers' boots on stone and the creak of wagons hauling loot. The few survivors who witnessed this described it as hearing civilization die. The Mongols spared approximately 3,000 people: weavers, metalworkers, engineers, physicians, skills they needed. Everyone else was expendable. These survivors were assembled on February 28th in the main square. Mongol guards chained them in groups of 50 and began the march east toward Mongol territories where they'd spend the rest of their lives as slaves. But first, Hulagu ordered them to look back. Every survivor was forced to turn and witness what remained of their home. The eastern wall, breached in 4 places, rubble spilling into streets. The House of Wisdom, burned shell with no roof. The Grand Mosque, standing but desecrated, its minaret toppled. The residential districts, block after block of charred buildings. The palace, partially demolished, its walls blackened by fire. Here's the detail that breaks your heart. Many of the survivors were seeing their city for the first time since the siege began. They'd been locked in their homes during the massacre, praying they'd be overlooked. Now, forced into daylight, they discovered that the city they remembered, vibrant, wealthy, alive, had been replaced by a graveyard. One Persian chronicler recorded a survivor saying, quote 29, "The survivors were marched away on March 1st. Behind them, 5,000 Mongol soldiers remained as garrison, not to hold territory, but to ensure nobody tried to rebuild. Baghdad was to remain a warning, and it would remain silent for generations." March 1258. A Persian merchant named Hassan al-Rashid, returning from China, approached Baghdad from the east and couldn't find it. Not because it was destroyed, but because the destruction was so complete that the landmarks he'd known were simply gone. The great mosques, rubble; the markets, ash; the palace, partially standing but gutted. The city that had housed 800,000 now held perhaps 15,000 survivors, huddled in ruins, subsisting on whatever they could scavenge. The Mongols had left a garrison of 5,000 troops to prevent resettlement. Baghdad was to remain a warning. This is what happens when you resist. But the real destruction wasn't visible to the eye. The irrigation systems destroyed. The canals filled in. The agricultural base that had supported civilization for 3,000 years, gone. Iraq's population in 1257 had been roughly 5 million. By 1260, it had dropped to 1 million. By 1300, fewer than 800,000, the same as Baghdad alone before the siege. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad didn't just kill a city. It killed the infrastructure that sustained an entire civilization. The land itself seemed cursed afterward, unable to support the populations it once had. Even today, historians can track the Mongol invasion in geological surveys. The irrigation canals were never rebuilt. Hassan al-Rashid's account, preserved in Persian chronicles, describes his confusion. Quote 30. "The 15,000 survivors lived like rats in the ruins. No functioning markets, no government, no organization beyond what individuals could cobble together. They subsisted on what they could scavenge from the ruins and whatever fish they could catch from the Tigris. The Mongol garrison prevented any organized rebuilding. Anyone attempting to repair a major building was executed. The message was clear. Baghdad must remain a monument to what happens when you resist the Mongols. Here's where the true catastrophe becomes visible. The irrigation systems that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization since Sumerian times, 5,000 years of accumulated engineering, were systematically destroyed. The Mongols had filled in the main canals with rubble, broken the dam mechanisms, collapsed the underground Qanat channels. Think about what this meant. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates had supported millions of people because of these water systems. Without them, the region couldn't sustain even a fraction of its former population. The agricultural collapse was immediate. By the harvest season of 1258, crop yields had dropped 90%. Farmers who'd worked the same land for generations abandoned their fields because water no longer reached them. Entire villages emptied as populations fled north toward still functioning irrigation in Mosul, or south toward the Persian Gulf. Let those population numbers sink in for a moment. 5 million to 1 million in 3 years. That's an 80% population decline, not from direct killing alone, but from the cascading effects of destroyed infrastructure, starvation, disease, collapse of trade networks, the death of agricultural capacity. Modern archaeological surveys using satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar have mapped the ancient canal systems. You can see them clearly from space. Straight lines cutting across the desert, filled in but leaving distinctive soil signatures. Geologists can identify exactly where Mongol destruction crews broke the canals. The damage was so thorough that even today, with modern engineering, those systems have never been fully restored. Baghdad became a cautionary tale whispered across the Islamic world. And the question that would haunt Islamic civilization for centuries was about to crystallize. If Baghdad, the city of God, defended by faith and the caliph's authority, could fall so completely, was anywhere safe? The fall of Baghdad in 1258 represents the single most important turning point in Islamic history. Before Baghdad, Islam was ascendant. Scientific advancement, territorial expansion, cultural dominance. After Baghdad, Islam turned inward, defensive, traumatized. Think about what ended in those 13 days. The Abbasid Caliphate, 626 years of unbroken succession. The House of Wisdom, the world's greatest repository of knowledge. The Golden Age of Islam, the era when Baghdad, Cordoba, and Damascus led the world in science and philosophy. All ended not gradually, but suddenly. One siege, 13 days. The psychological impact on the Islamic world was seismic. If Baghdad, the city of God, home of the Caliph, protected by millions of believers' prayers, could fall so completely, then nowhere was safe. No divine protection existed. The Mongols had proven that faith couldn't stop arrows. This trauma echoed for centuries. Islamic scholars began emphasizing the afterlife over earthly achievement. Scientific inquiry, once celebrated, became suspect. Hadn't that been Baghdad's pride before God allowed its destruction? The intellectual confidence that had driven the Golden Age evaporated. By 1300, the Islamic world had turned inward. Its great age of external conquest and internal innovation both finished. The numbers tell the story of collapse. In 1200, the Islamic world had produced 73% of the world's scientific papers and mathematical treatises. By 1300, that number had dropped to 12%. Universities that had hosted thousands of students shrank to hundreds. The great astronomical observatories closed. Medical schools stopped teaching surgery. The Islamic world didn't just lose Baghdad. It lost its intellectual momentum. Here's what the chroniclers documented. After 1258, Islamic scholars began interpreting Baghdad's fall as divine punishment for excessive worldly pursuit. Knowledge that didn't directly serve religious purposes became suspect. Mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, fields where Islamic scholars had led the world, were now viewed as the pride that preceded destruction. Religious conservatives gained power by arguing that Baghdad fell because its scholars studied Greek philosophy instead of the Quran. The shift was immediate and devastating. Damascus, which had been a center of astronomical study, closed its observatory in 1262. Cairo's medical school stopped teaching anatomy in 1265. Handling corpses was suddenly deemed impious. The Great Translation movement, which had preserved classical knowledge, ended. No new texts were translated after 1260. Think about the psychological trauma. For 5 centuries, Muslims had believed their civilization was ascendant, protected by divine favor, destined to spread across the world. Baghdad's fall shattered that certainty. If God allowed the Caliph himself to be trampled like a common criminal, what did that say about Islam's place in the world? The defensive mindset became permanent. Where pre-Baghdad Islamic rulers had confidently expanded into new territories, post-Baghdad rulers fortified what they held. Innovation was replaced by preservation. The question shifted from, quote, 31, quote, to, quote, 32, quote, Cairo would survive. Damascus would endure. But they would never again be what Baghdad had been, the confident center of a civilization that believed it owned the future. That confidence died in 13 days. And 7 centuries later, its ghost still haunts the Islamic world. Stand in modern Baghdad, and you're standing on 30 feet of crushed civilization. Archaeologists estimate that 90% of pre-Mongol Baghdad remains buried beneath the current city. Museums will never display the manuscripts that dissolved in the Tigris. We'll never read the medical texts, mathematical treatises, philosophical dialogues that existed nowhere else. The intellectual loss is incalculable. But here's what makes Baghdad 1258 truly haunting. It worked. Hulagu Khan's strategy of total annihilation as deterrence, it worked. After Baghdad fell, every Islamic city between the Tigris and the Mediterranean surrendered without resistance. Aleppo opened its gates. Damascus welcomed the Mongols with flowers. Even Cairo, seat of Mamluk power, considered submission. The Mongols had achieved what they wanted. Terror so complete that resistance became psychologically impossible. 800,000 died to teach 200 million the cost of defiance. And they learned. The trauma never faded. Even today, the fall of Baghdad remains the Islamic world's deepest wound. The moment when divine protection failed. When faith couldn't stop conquest. When civilization itself proved fragile as smoke. 766 years later, the library shelves in Islamic universities still have gaps where Baghdad's books should be. The ghost of that knowledge haunts every historian who studies what was lost. And in every Middle Eastern crisis since, the shadow of 1258 lingers. The memory of a civilization that thought itself immortal. Until 13 days proved it was merely human. Archaeological excavations in modern Baghdad reveal the terror in layers. 30 feet down, they find the burn layer from 1258, a band of ash, charcoal, and bone fragments that marks where a civilization ended. Everything below that layer shows a prosperous, sophisticated city. Everything above shows rebuilding that took centuries and never matched what was lost. The immediate strategic impact was exactly what Hulagu intended. When news of Baghdad's complete destruction spread, resistance collapsed across the entire region. Aleppo, Syria's second greatest city, surrendered on sight of the Mongol army in 1260. Not a single arrow fired. Damascus, the ancient seat of the Umayyad Caliphate, opened its gates and threw flowers before Mongol horses. The governor literally came out with gifts, begging to become a vassal. Think about the mathematics of terror. 800,000 dead in Baghdad bought the Mongols the surrender of 20 major cities without fighting. From a purely strategic perspective, the massacre was devastatingly effective. One overwhelming example of total destruction eliminated the need for further conquest. Every city from Baghdad to the Mediterranean learned the same lesson: resist and cease to exist. But here's what makes this truly haunting. The psychological wound never healed. Islamic historians writing 300 years after Baghdad still couldn't discuss it without expressing trauma. The loss entered Islamic consciousness as proof that the Golden Age had ended, that divine favor had been withdrawn, that the world had fundamentally changed. Modern scholars estimate we lost approximately 40% of medieval Islamic knowledge in those 13 days. Medical texts describing surgical procedures, mathematical treatises solving equations, astronomical charts mapping stars, philosophical works engaging with Greek and Persian traditions, all gone. The Renaissance in Europe was partly built on preserved Islamic knowledge. Imagine what humanity lost when 400,000 manuscripts dissolved in the Tigris. And in the Middle East today, when scholars discuss cultural destruction, when politicians reference civilizational trauma, when historians mark turning points, they still return to 1258. The fall of Baghdad remains the moment everything changed. The moment when the Islamic world's confident expansion ended and its long defensive era began. 13 days that echo through 8 centuries.